let's start with Fast and Furious. What was that supposed to be?
Oh, that's a good question. I can tell you how they tried to sell it to me.
Okay.
So Fast and Furious was a investigation into firearms trafficking that was occurring in southern Arizona, and the firearms that were being trafficked were ending up in the hands of the Mexican drug cartels. Fast and Furious was an investigation that was launched out of the newly created DOJ strike forces at that time. And it was to combat that illegal firearms trafficking. I was told this is how we're going to take down the cartel, is by following these guns, taking off these trafficking networks, and ultimately prosecuting, the Mexican drug cartels. The problem is, some people say it went awry, or there were some things that happened that, weren't supposed to happen. But the way it looked to me and the way that it was briefed to me, that it was kind of the plan all along to facilitate the trafficking of these firearms to the Mexican drug cartels, allow them to be used in crime. Then when they're traced by the Mexican authorities, count those stats to establish that this firearms trafficking was happening. And there's no way you're going to take down a cartel. That's why it didn't make sense.
So what happened then? What made you red pill and say, I got to blow the whistle?
Yeah. Well, it was definitely a red pill moment, or
come to Jesus moment.
Yeah, enlightening. I'm trying to think. It was like a Mitchell and Webb. There's an old British TV show. It's not that old, but they're dressed in, they're pretending to be Nazi soldiers in World War II. And the one asked the other one, hey, have you ever looked at our uniforms with the skull and crossbones? Like, are we the baddies? Are we the bad guys here? So that was kind of my moment too. So what happened was, when I first got to, and you have to understand, a lot of things led up to the establishment of the strike force, which was a DOJ-run entity. So for the first time in my career, I was assigned to a task force that was prosecutorial-led and not enforcement-led. So it was led by the U.S. Attorney's Office, not by law enforcement. Normally on a task force, you have law enforcement running it. You have agents and officers from different jurisdictions that provide different expertise, different assets, availability, things like that. This is the first time I'd ever been assigned where one was being run by the U.S. Attorney's Office or by a prosecuting authority. So,
and what is, just so people know, tell me what a strike force is.
Right. So strike force was brand new in 2009. They were launched. It was funded by DOJ as an initiative to combat firearms trafficking. And recently, also during that time in 2009, firearms trafficking was added to what's called OCDEF, the Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force, which used to only be narcotics trafficking. And when you can OCDEF a case, then you get all these funds that are open to you, that you can do wiretaps, you can bring in multiple surveillance teams, you can cross borders easily, things like that. So in 2009 was the first time firearms trafficking was allowed to be OCDEF. So DOJ created these strike forces and put 4 of them. Originally there were 4 throughout the southwest border, ranging from California to Texas. So one being in Phoenix, which is the one I was assigned to. And so that's what a strike force is compared to a task force, which is run by cops, make cases, and then take those to prosecution. So the whole point of it was designed to combat firearms trafficking. You also have to understand in 2009, so earlier in 2009, the Department of Defense had said the instability along the U.S. southern border caused by the violence created by the Mexican drug cartels is a threat to national security, right? So that opens up the floodgates. Once you declare that, then all bets, all the rules go away about things that you can do. So all these other initiatives start to take place. So also in 2009, DOJ and the ATF release a statistic that says 90% of all crime guns in Mexico are U.S. sourced firearms. They come from the U.S. civilian firearms market, and they're funneled down south, and they're used in these horrible crimes that are being happening in Mexico.
Okay, wait. I want to make sure, because they manipulate words all the time.
Yes.
When it comes from the American market, does that mean it's a gun produced here and sold here and then smuggled across the border? What do they mean by that?
Well, see, that's part of what I consider to be the okey doke, right? So they don't define or quantify that enough. What they say is 90% of the guns recovered in Mexico are U.S. sourced firearms. Well, that information comes from the tracing system. The only guns that we can successfully trace are U.S. sourced firearms. Either they were manufactured here or imported into the U.S. Those are the only ones we can trace. You can't successfully trace anything that was made in, Pakistan or China or Romania. All right. So that number should, in theory, be 100%. 100% of the guns successfully traced that are recovered in Mexico are U.S. sourced firearms. So what happens in 2009 when we start this initiative, ATF sends people down to Mexico to start. ATF also launches Spanish E-Trace and gives the Mexican authorities access to it so they can start tracing all their firearms. At some point in early 2009, mid 2009, I think 2 compact discs show up at the tracing center from Mexico where they had gone in and just opened up their vaults and got every manufacturer and serial number of every firearm in the vault and dumped it in the tracing system. Well, that 90% dropped down to like 17% overnight as soon as these guns were put in there. So only 17% of the guns in Mexican vaults were coming back to a U.S. source firearm.
I've never heard that.
Yeah. So that totally defeats the argument that 90% of the crime guns in Mexico are U.S. source firearms. So then, lo and behold, a short time later, Fast and Furious takes off, which is us facilitating, coercing the gun dealers into cooperating, make them do transactions that they knew that they weren't comfortable doing and express their uncomfortableness with it. Greasing the skids so that they weren't stopped by Arizona DPS, they weren't stopped by Customs or ICE, or it was ICE at the time, or Border Patrol or anything like that to make sure they got into Mexico and then sit back and wait on the traces. Now, even if you're doing all that, what you're not telling the American people is, and this is a big part of it, say Colt, which is a U.S. manufacturer, Colt, DPMS, any of the large major U.S. gun suppliers. If they do a government-to-government sale, which they sell the guns to the U.S. government and the government sells them to the Mexican government or provides them to the Mexican government, or the Mexican government purchases those firearms directly from Colt, all right? Once they're in Mexico, they're diverted to the black market, used in a crime, recovered, and traced. Colt's the manufacturer. So even though it says we sold this to the Mexican government, they count that as a U.S. sourced firearm. And they blame the U.S. civilian firearms market for it.